Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to go over Xiao's weapon choices and kind of break down what his best free-to-play options are and compare him to his paid 5-star options and hopefully give you a better picture on whether or not you should actually spend your money on these weapons. I'm going to go over most of his 4-star options like the Blackcliff Pole, the Deathmatch, Prototype Star Glitter, Crescent Pike, and Favonius Lance. I am deliberately omitting the Lithic Spear, Dragon's Bane, and the Royal Spear. Reason being that their passive effects are generally regarded as not very useful for Xiao. There are some arguments for the Lithic Spear and Royal Spear's passive, but having a physical damage main stat for the Lithic Spear is not very useful for Xiao. And the mechanics of the Royal Spear's passive, that is, dealing damage will increase your crit rate by 8% up to a max of 5 stacks, and a crit hit will remove all stacks, is generally not a very good passive when you have decent crit rate on your build already. And so with that said, Xiao's canon weapon is actually the Primordial Jade Winged Spear. This weapon is a 5-star, so that means you're going to need to open up your wallet and swipe the credit card. But you'll also have to be okay with the fact that you can also pull the Primordial Jade Cutter, because the weapon banner truly is a 50-50, so it is a very huge risk. If you do not want the Primordial Jade Cutter, then you definitely should not pull on this banner if you only want the Jade Spear. And so before we get into these calculations, first thing is first, these calculations are done with plus 16 artifacts. This means he is going to have a 38.7% attack percent bonus, 38.7% animal damage bonus, 258 flat attack from the feather, 51.6% extra crit damage from the circlet, and Xiao is going to be at level 70 Ascension Phase 5 with talent level 8 scaling. I am also not going to be taking into account any artifact set bonuses besides the 2-piece Viridescent Venerer, which gives him an extra 15% animal damage bonus. And so there are a ton of numbers with these calculations, and people seem to love math, but they hate seeing so many numbers. So what I've done is I've visualized everything into nice charts so that we can break it down and draw some conclusions. So I'm going to break his damage down into 2 different parts: his damage while he's in his burst mode and while he's not. And as we look at both parts, I'll break it down by each weapon, and then we'll also look at his crit damage versus his non-crit damage. Starting with Xiao's non-burst damage, his normal attack combo string, the Crescent Pike is very much the clear winner here. This obviously makes sense because while he's not in his burst, he is going to deal physical damage, and the Crescent Pike has a physical damage main stat bonus. These calculations are also taking into consideration the passive that the Crescent Pike has, which is that after picking up an elemental particle, your normal and charge attacks will deal an additional 20% attack as damage. Because Xiao's combos have a couple double hits, that passive procs about 8 total times. The weapons that come next in terms of physical damage is going to be the Jade Spear, the Skyward Spine, and then the Blackcliff at 3 stacks. The Prototype Star Glitter at 2 stacks also does pretty well, and then the Deathmatch is doing the least amount of damage, even with its highest multiplier. The crit damage comparisons pretty much tell the same story, except that in this case, the Blackcliff Pole starts to compete pretty nicely with the Skyward Spine. The other part of his kit while he's not in his burst is going to be his E-skill, so let's go ahead and take a look at that. We can see here that the Crescent Pike starts to drop off pretty substantially compared to the Blackcliff Pole, the Skyward Spine, and the Jade Spear. It pretty much deals the same damage as the Deathmatch, the Prototype, the Favonius Lance, and the Blackcliff, when the Blackcliff has between about 0 and 1 stacks. And then over here on the flip side, the crit damage tells a completely different story because the Blackcliff is starting to rule out against everything else. The Primordial Jade Spear is still doing a great job, and then the Blackcliff Pole comes in at second even at 0 stacks, and then the Skyward Spine, and then everything else follows after that. Starting with the Deathmatch, the Crescent Pike, the Favonius Lance, and then the Prototype. Alright, so now let's combine everything together, all of his damage while he's not in his burst, and take a look at what weapon is actually the best. We can see that the Blackcliff Pole with 3 stacks, the Jade Spear, and the Crescent Pike all compete pretty nicely with each other. And then the weapons that come next after that is going to be the Blackcliff Pole with 0, 1, and 2 stacks, and the Skyward Spine. And then the final tier of weapons is going to be the Deathmatch with 1 enemy, the Prototype with 2 stacks, and the Favonius Lance. It's very surprising how well the Crescent Pike does, just because of the amount of physical damage it can output. But don't get the wrong idea here, because Crescent Pike might be one of his best weapons while not in his burst, but who really plays Xiao not for his burst? And so when we take a look at the numbers for his burst, that picture is going to become much clearer. So let's go ahead and move on to his burst damage. With these charts, we're going to be taking a look at his main damage source, which is his plunging attacks. So if we take a look at that, we can clearly see that his best weapons are going to be the Jade Spear and the Blackcliff Pole at 3 stacks. The Skyward Spine comes pretty closely right after the 3-stack Blackcliff Pole, and then after that comes the Blackcliff Pole at less stacks, and then the Deathmatch, the Favonius Lance, and the Crescent Pike. This is his non-crit damage, so if we take a look at his crit damage now, we can see that the Blackcliff Pole edges out against every weapon. Even at 0 stacks, it is almost reaching the power of a Jade Spear, and then at 1 stack, it's pretty much matching the power of a Jade Spear. And then at 2 and 3 stacks, it's clearly doing more damage than all of his other options. So that means at higher refinement levels, the Blackcliff Pole really has the opportunity to outperform the Jade Spear. However, this should come with an asterisk, because this is only going to happen if you can get stacks. Refinement only improves the Blackcliff Pole while you have your stacks from killing enemies. In other words, a Refinement 5 Blackcliff Pole with 0 stacks performs exactly the same as a Refinement 1 Blackcliff Pole with 0 stacks. And getting stacks is going to depend completely on the types of enemies that you're fighting. So this means that consistently getting stacks with the Blackcliff Pole can sometimes be pretty hard. For example, if you're fighting a group of Fatui skirmishers, the max that you're probably going to get is only 1 or 2. Or if you're fighting a single Ruin Guard, you're going to have 0. But on the other hand, for example, in the Abyss, if you're just fighting a bunch of Hilly Churls, you'll be able to maintain the 3 stacks very reliably. So in that case, let's look at the Blackcliff Pole when we don't have any stacks, or if we only have 1 stack. So first off, we have the Blackcliff with 0 stacks versus the Skyward Spine. And we can see that when we don't crit, the Blackcliff Pole does slightly less damage. But when we crit, in all cases, we are going to be dealing more damage. These calculations are even including the 40% attack damage from the Spine's passive. And then here we increase the Blackcliff to have 1 stack, and it starts to close the gap for non-crits even more. And then the crits, they start dealing even more damage than the Skyward Spine. So even at 0 and 1 stacks, the Blackcliff Pole does pretty nicely for a 4-star compared to a 5-star. And then at 2 and 3 stacks, it's pretty much doing the same or even a little bit better than a 5-star. Alright, so now let's compare the Blackcliff directly with the Jade Spear at 0 stacks. And the story here is that both the crit and the non-crit damage for a Blackcliff at 0 stacks does less damage than the Jade Spear. But as we get more and more stacks, the crit damage portion of the Blackcliff starts doing more damage than the Jade Spear, but the non-crit damage still does less damage. So in these calculations, we've seen that the Blackcliff Pole does the most damage in terms of raw numbers when we hit crits, but I mentioned earlier that many of these other weapons also increase Xiao's crit rate. So let's start to have a discussion about how that's going to come into play. The Blackcliff build is going to have naturally lower crit rate than all of the other builds that have extra crit rate. So that means the Skyward Spine, the Jade Spear, the Deathmatch, those are all weapons that give you extra crit rate. So what exactly does this mean? It means that you'll get more consistent crit damage, but its damage is going to be lower. The Blackcliff build will be much more random in terms of when you actually get your crit damage. If you get unlucky with your crits, then the Blackcliff build is going to do less damage. And so there are ways to get around our low crit rate. For example, we can focus on crit rate substats in your build, or we can utilize the Cryo Resonance for an extra 15% more crit rate to enemies that are affected by cryo or if they're frozen. If we can hit about 60 to 70% crit rate on the Blackcliff build, then I'd call that pretty good. So it's really going to come down to this. The 5-star weapons are going to give you very consistent crits for slightly lower damage. The Deathmatch is going to function similarly, but the damage is much lower than the 5 stars. And the Blackcliff build is going to give you higher crit damage, but more randomly. So let's look at how much more damage we're actually doing between his highest damage options. We'll be using his plunging attack damage while in his burst to do these comparisons. So starting starting with non-crit damage, the Jade Spear pretty much outperforms all of the weapons on the list by a pretty decent margin. And the Jade Spear is doing about 30% more damage than our 4-star options. But this is only true for the Blackcliff when the Blackcliff has about 0 or 1 stacks. The Jade Spear does about 20% more damage than the Skyward Spine, and also about 20% more damage when the Blackcliff has 2 stacks. When the Blackcliff has 3 stacks, it does about 15% more damage. Now on the crit damage side, the Blackcliff Pole is the clear winner. So at 0 stacks, it just barely underperforms the Jade Spear, but at 3 stacks, it deals about 11% more damage than the Jade Spear. At 2 stacks, it beats it just ever so slightly, and then at 1 stack, it deals slightly lower damage than the Jade Spear. Compared to the Skyward Spine, the Blackcliff at 0 stacks does 9% more damage when we crit, and with max stacks it actually does 32% more damage. I think that's quite a significant margin. The Blackcliff versus the Deathmatch at 0 stacks is going to do 18% more damage, and with max stacks we do 44% more damage. In my personal opinion, I think that damage is more worth it than the extra 30% crit rate. Because for example, if we were at 60 or 70% with our build and we had to choose a weapon, choosing between 60 or 70% crit rate versus 90 to 100, I would go with the lower crit rate and the higher damage. Because 60 to 70 is still a pretty good chance to hit those crits. And again, we could make that up with a cryo resonance if we really wanted to. So now that you actually know the percent difference in damage between these options, you should decide if you think more consistent damage with higher crit rate is worth it for you, or a higher crit damage with a lower crit rate is worth it for you. So in conclusion, the Jade Spear is his best weapon for the most consistent damage and crit damage. However, the Blackcliff Pole can compete very well with it. The only caveat to that is that you need stacks for it to be better, and that means it's going to depend completely on the enemies that you fight. It's going to be great against large groups and not so good against small groups. The Skyward Spine is going to give you consistent crits, but at slightly lower damage. However, it does give energy recharge for the high burst uptime. When it comes to the deathmatch, the crits are quite low compared to the consistency, and there is no energy recharge for this weapon. As far as energy recharge weapons, the Favonius Lance and the Prototype Star Glitter are his weakest damaging weapons, but they will give you high uptime on your burst, and they actually compete pretty nicely in terms of damage and crit damage with the deathmatch. However, with a lower consistency to hit those crits. So Xiao really doesn't have a best weapon. It's going to completely depend on how your substats are on your artifacts, whether you have good energy recharge, crit rate, or crit damage. And then the final icing on the cake is if you want to build your team for cryo resonance. So that's pretty much all I have for you guys in this video. I hope that you guys learned something new, and I hope that this video helped you. And if it did, please leave me a like and consider subscribing to the channel. Until next time, I will see you later.